Okay, 7th grade, so today we are on page 23 in our reading packet. Today is Thursday the 14th, and we're going to be taking a look at using different kinds of sentences. So we're going to do 23 together, and then you guys will do 24 on your own. So let's take a look at the top up here. It says, building your sentences in different ways can help you eliminate wordiness and make clear connections between ideas. There are 4 basic types of sentences. So what these different types of sentences do is that in your writing, it kind of makes your writing a little bit more interesting and less simple, that's the first type of sentence is a simple sentence, which just means that it's an independent clause. Now, what's an independent clause? It means it can stand on its own. All that a simple sentence is one independent clause. So jousting was a medieval sport. He went to the store. He was shopping for tomatoes. He couldn't find tomatoes. Tomatoes were sold out. He had to go to a different store. There was none at that store either. We're just like talking in a super simple way. It makes us sound a little bit like a robot, right? So here it says jousting was a medieval sport. It's just one independent clause. Now, an independent clause has a subject, which is jousting, predicate, was, and it makes sense on its own. So a compound has 2 or more independent clauses. Compound sentences usually are combined by using words a transition word. So we can look at the acronym. I'm pretty sure we looked at it before. Fanboys. So I'm writing them right up here. So it will be combined using these words here usually. There are other words, but these are like our most common words. So if you look here, it says medieval knights had to be experts in battle. So if you cut off this end part, and jousting was one way to prepare for battle, if you just look at this and pretend this comma is a period, medieval knights had to be experts in battle. That's a simple sentence. Jousting was one way to prepare for battle. That's also a simple sentence. But when you use a comma and that word and, which is one of our fanboy words over here, it makes it a compound sentence because you're putting 2 simple sentences together. So medieval knights had to be experts in battle, and jousting was one way to prepare for battle. Okay, so all you're doing is combining 2 independent clauses. Now, a complex sentence has 1 independent clause and 1 or more dependent clauses. Now, what is a dependent clause? A dependent clause doesn't make sense on its own, right? So it has a subject and a predicate, just like an independent clause does, but it doesn't make sense on its own. Usually it's going to start with a word like because, although, after, things like that. So here we see the underlined part is our dependent clause. So although jousting was a form of entertainment, and the way we can tell that's a dependent clause would be if that was a period and it stopped right there and it said although jousting was a form of entertainment, period, it would leave you like although jousting was a form of entertainment, what? Like, what else are you going to say? Because it doesn't sound like you're done talking, right? So then it also lets knights practice important skills. That's an independent clause because it makes sense on its own. If we said jousting also lets knights practice important skills, that makes sense on its own. It's an independent clause. Usually when we separate that dependent and independent clause, usually when we separate that independent and dependent clause, there's going to be a comma there, which will help us separate the 2 and differentiate between them. The last type is a compound complex sentence. So this one is a little bit more complicated. So it has 2 or more independent clauses. So it has to have 2 independent clauses and 1 or more dependent clauses. So usually it's just going to be 2 independent, 1 dependent. So here it says jousting wasn't as dangerous as combat. Well, we know that's an independent clause because it makes sense on its own. Then we have, but a knight could still be hurt. So if we said a knight could still be hurt, that is an independent clause as well. And then it's used, combined using one of our fanboy words. So we have but. So jousting wasn't as dangerous as a combat, but a knight could still be hurt. That would just make it a compound sentence. But what makes it a compound complex sentence is that we add this dependent clause with unnecessary information at the end, when he fell off his horse. So jousting wasn't as dangerous as combat, independent clause, but a knight could still be hurt, independent clause with a compound word, and then when he fell off his horse is our dependent clause. So this just makes your writing a little bit more interesting to read and a little bit like less basic and like robotic sounding. Okay, so let's take a look at the practice here. It says underline. I'm going to highlight as always. You guys are used to that by now. The independent clause or clauses in each sentence. Then write simple, compound, complex, or compound complex. So we're just highlighting the independent clause or clauses if there's more than one. When would there be more than one independent clause? Only in a compound complex sentence, right? So it says, hint, the independent and dependent clauses in a complex or compound complex sentence may be in any order. For instance, the dependent clause may come first. So it's just saying that the dependent or independent clause could be at the beginning or end. It's not indicative of where it's going to be. So it can be anywhere. So a knight's training began early in life and it ended in the knight's teenage years. So we took out this and word, which we know we're either going to have compound complex or compound because we have that conjunction here. A knight's training began early in life. If that was a period, would that make sense on its own? Yes. So that's our independent clause. Now let's see if we have two independent clauses. It ended in the knight's teenage years. Does that make sense on its own? Yes. Because if you said training ended in the knight's teenage years, that would make sense. So we know because of this word that we either have a compound or compound complex. Well, if we have two independent clauses only, has two or more independent clauses is compound, has two or more independent clauses and a dependent clause. So it has to be just compound. Joust kept knights in great condition for real battles. Is there any commas or any of those conjunction words in there? No. Does this sentence make sense? Yes. So we have just one independent clause makes up the whole sentence, and that makes what kind of sentence? Simple. Because a simple sentence is just made up of one independent clause. When spectators attended joust, they often rooted for a favorite knight. So if I said we have a comma, so we know where to split it. When spectators attended joust, if I just said that, does that make sense on its own? No, because it leaves us asking when spectators attended joust, what? Like what happened? So that would be a dependent clause. And then we have, they often rooted for a favorite knight. So we said spectators often rooted for a favorite knight. Does that make sense on its own? Yes. So that is a independent clause. Now, here we have one dependent clause, one independent clause. So what sentence is made up of just one independent clause and one dependent clause? Complex, right? Because compound complex, we need to have two independent clauses. So this just leaves us with a complex sentence. Although jousts often ended in bloodshed, the matches were a popular part of life, and townspeople regularly gathered to watch these events. So we separate with the commas. Although jousts often ended in bloodshed, leaves us asking, although jousts often ended in bloodshed, what? So we know that's a dependent clause. If we just said the matches were a popular part of life, does that make sense on its own? Yes, it does. So that is our independent clause. And then lastly, we have a conjunction, and then we have the sentence, townspeople regularly gather to watch these events. Does that make sense on its own? Yes. So we have a second independent clause. So we have a conjunction, 2 independent clauses, and 1 dependent clause. So what sentence is made of 2 independent clauses and 1 dependent clause? Compound complex. Oh. The last one says jousting competitions were usually part of a larger tournament that included other events as well. So this one's a little bit tricky because we've been helping ourselves to separate the parts of the sentence with those commas, but there's not always going to be a comma to separate the parts of a sentence. So when we see jousting competitions were usually a part of a larger tournament, that's going to be an independent clause. When we see a word like that or something that starts to give us a little bit of extra unnecessary information, then that's how we know that we're starting an independent clause or another clause. So which in this case would be a dependent clause, because that is our subject, included is our predicate. So when we start to have another subject and another predicate, that's when we know we're having a second clause, whether it's independent or dependent. So in this one, it is a dependent clause. So if we have 1 independent clause and 1 dependent clause, what type of sentence does that make this last one? Complex. So commas aren't always going to separate the clauses, but if you see a second subject and a second predicate, that's how you know that a second clause is being introduced. So now you guys are going to do page 24 on your own. If you guys have any questions, I'll be available for Zoom, extra Zoom office hours. I'll have my regular office hours from 11 to 2, but then I'll have those evening Zoom hours, which is not required. It's just for if you have extra questions or need any help and you're not able to get in touch with me during the day, then you can do that between 6:30 and 7. I'll be on Zoom for 7th grade. I start with 8th grade at 7 o'clock, so you need to make sure that you reach out to me between that 6:30 and 7 o'clock time period. So if you have any questions, I'll talk to you tomorrow, between 11 to 2 or 6:30 to 7.